Hey OCV, it's Jason. I just wanted to come on here and do something about Bible study because now that we have a little more time at home, hopefully you're able to read the Bible in a more predictable way. Maybe if you didn't get a chance before, now maybe it's part of your life and you can incorporate reading scripture every day or every other day. And a lot of times when people first start reading, it's a little daunting because you're not really sure what everything means. So we're going to go over how to read the Bible and some tools and tips on what to do. Now, one of the books that I think is really good is How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. It's by seminary professors who are really good at explaining things at the lowest level so that anybody can kind of glean things from the Bible. Now they have the official seminary uh, things on how to study the Bible, but that specific book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, it's for people who don't have seminary training. So they want anybody to be able to read it, and they even have some free resources online, so you can look some of those things up. But let's go over a couple of the things that maybe you've heard Pastor Charlie talk about or you've heard in other Bible studies. So the first thing would be exegesis. That's just talking about what the actual scripture meant to the people who were reading it. And you have to use context and you have to use language, you have to use genre, all these different aspects of what the written scripture was saying. But exegesis might be something that Pastor Charlie has used to explain a passage that he was going over. And then you have a second part that's related to exegesis. Actually, exegesis is the first step in hermeneutics. So you might have heard people saying someone used a hermeneutical principle to figure out what some scripture meant. Well, that just means what is the Bible explaining on, to the people who initially read it, and how does that translate into maybe a newer, different way of looking at it today? Kind of like the way that we had the law and the prophets before Jesus, but Jesus fulfilled the law and the prophets. So there was one interpretation of Isaiah at the time that people initially read it, and Jesus made a new interpretation that didn't change the old one. He just fulfilled a different aspect of, for instance, Isaiah 60, Isaiah 61, 53, all of those passages. So we had part of the idea initially, and Jesus brought the fulfillment of what that idea was supposed to mean in the scripture. So we want to do the same thing. We want to know what the Bible said, and we want to know what the Bible is saying today to us. And sometimes it's the exact same thing as it meant to the people that initially read it, and then sometimes we have a different view of it because of maybe we live in a different context than people did. So a good example of this would be if you have an axiom that might have changed over time. We might say, oh, this is something that ticked me off. Well, 1,000 years from now, you can look up the word tick and it means a bug, or it might mean moving your head really fast. You could use the word off, and that means that you either put something on or off. But when you put those words together, we know that meant it annoyed you. But if you don't understand the axiom, the figure of speech, then there's no way you would interpret a comic 1,000 years from now if it said something like, this ticked me off. Or even some easy everyday thing like, oh wow, that's really cool. Do we mean that this is a temperature cool, or is it a figure of speech meaning, oh, I like that? So the Bible is full of those types of things. So that's why we want to use exegesis to see what it really meant in the time that it was written and for the audience that it was written for. And then we use hermeneutics to say, okay, if they meant cool, like the ancient way of saying cool, we can interpret it into good or cool or I like that. Those are different things that we want to look at with exegesis and with the hermeneutics. So, one of the first things that I would like to talk about regarding exegesis and hermeneutics is what are we looking at in terms of our Bible translation, because that will have a big effect on how we look at exegesis. We have the Greek scriptures and we have the Hebrew scriptures, and they have to be interpreted a certain way. We have a spectrum today that we use, and we say we're going to have some type of formal equivalence or we're going to have a functional equivalence. Formal might be more of like a direct way of translating a word. So if I have a word that means light, I will translate it into light. If I have a word, the light of life, and then I translate it into what it means, like you could translate it into Jesus or something like that. That would actually be the functional equivalence or dynamic. So we want to make sure that we're reading a scripture that is appropriate for what our purpose is in that reading. If we're going to do Bible study, we don't want a lot of dynamic equivalence, or we don't want a commentary. If we're studying something, we want to have something that's pretty close to what they originally, not just what they originally meant, but what they originally said, because there's a lot of wiggle room for those figures of speech. So an example of something that would be more formal would be like King James or ESV. Pastor Charlie uses ESV, which I think makes sense because we're studying the Bible on Sunday morning. A dynamic one would be more like NIV or New Living Translation. That might be good for someone who's new to Scripture or a child, maybe just looking at a concept, so that you don't need to know as many axioms or figures of speech. It might spell it out a little bit easier or use terms that would be relevant today. And sometimes that's a little dangerous because there's a little more room for commentary. Now, the really good dynamic equivalence, the translations that are good with dynamic equivalence, they try not to steer away from the overall meaning because they have a big group of people that are all scholars, and then they look through and say, hey, let's decide what we should translate this specific phrase. You have other more free interpretations, which would be closer to commentaries. Like the Message Bible is a good example. It's a very easy thing to read for the Psalms, for instance, and it gives really good concepts. I'm not going to use that for Bible study, though. So here's a good example. We have John 3:14 through 16. That's a really basic scripture that a lot of us know. We can have the formal equivalence, which would say for John 3:14, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Well, the Message is going to say, in the same way that Moses lifted the serpent in the desert, so people could have something to see and then believe, it is necessary for the Son of Man to be lifted up. Now, if I use an actual Greek translation, like the actual Greek, there's nothing in there about so that people can have something to believe in it. But the guy that's doing the Message Bible is trying to interpret it partially. So those are all different ways that you can use the scriptures. Now, what I want you to do is to figure out if you can get an online a set of scriptures like an ESV, or maybe you have some hard copy Bibles at home, and then figure out which ones you're going to use for Bible study, for devotional reading, and those different purposes. And then if you don't have an ESV, download a copy of that, or you can pick one up. They're not very expensive, and maybe we even have some resources when we start going back, meeting together physically, with like ESV versions or different versions of the Bible. And I want you to figure out which ones you're going to use and download, like either through Logos or Blue Letter Bible. You can download a concordance. And a concordance, like this is a gigantic concordance hard copy. It's super thick. You can get that online for free. You can just download it. You can even get the equivalent of this, which is like a Greek New Testament, where it just has everything written out in Greek and English together. It's called an interlinear, and you can get that on your phone. So look for those things, and then next video I do, we'll continue to talk about the different translations and concordances and some helpful tips on how to use them. All right, God bless you guys.